Arguments are like quicksand. You step into one thinking you'll stand your ground, but the longer you stay, the deeper you sink. Most of us don't plan to argue, it just happens. It begins with a disagreement, a misunderstanding, or a difference in perspective. And before we know it, our emotions take the wheel. You feel your heart rate climb, your voice gets louder, and you're not listening anymore. You're defending, attacking, proving. And here's the catch, no one wins in that space. Because arguments aren't about truth, they're about control. They're not about solving problems, they're about protecting egos. And when two egos go to war, the relationship loses every single time. Think about the last time you found yourself in an argument. You probably walked away with your mind racing, replaying what you could have said, what you should have said, or what you wish they would have understood. But did it fix anything? Did it bring you closer to the other person? Probably not. Instead, you walked away drained, frustrated, maybe even angry. That's the trap. Arguments trick you into thinking that if you just say the right words, if you just push hard enough, you'll come out on top. But in reality, the harder you push, the harder the other person pushes back. It's a cycle of escalation, and it never ends with peace. Arguments thrive on reaction. Someone raises their voice, so you raise yours. Someone gets defensive, so you double down. It's like adding fuel to a fire. You're not putting it out, you're making it bigger. And the more it grows, the less you remember why it even started. That's another part of the trap. By the time you're in the heat of it, the original issue gets buried under layers of pride, anger, and miscommunication. You might have started arguing about who left the dishes in the sink, but 5 minutes later you're dragging out old wounds, past mistakes, and words that cut deeper than you meant them to. The argument is no longer about dishes. It's about respect, validation, fairness, love. And those are not things you win by yelling louder. The cost of this trap is high. Relationships get chipped away at little by little. Trust gets weakened. Communication becomes something to avoid instead of something to embrace. And in the workplace, arguments don't just harm relationships, they kill progress. A project stalls. A team divides, productivity drops, all because two people decided that proving a point was more important than finding a solution. But here's the hardest part about this trap. It feels good in the moment. There's a strange satisfaction in fighting back and proving yourself right, in landing that sharp comeback. It feeds the ego. For a split second, you feel powerful. But power in an argument is temporary, and it comes at the expense of connection. It's like winning a battle but losing the war. You might silence the other person, but you don't earn their respect. You might get the last word, but you don't get understanding. Most of us don't realize how often we walk into this trap until it's too late. It happens in marriages, friendships, boardrooms, classrooms, even with strangers in traffic. It's universal. And the reason it's so easy to fall into is because arguments are fueled by emotion, and emotion is fast. You feel disrespected, and before you think, you react. You feel misunderstood, and before you breathe, you defend. That's how quicksand works. You take one step in without noticing, and suddenly you're stuck. The only way out of this trap is awareness. Awareness that arguing doesn't solve problems, it multiplies them. Awareness that in every argument, there's a choice. You can fight to win, or you can choose to resolve, but you can't do both. And when you realize that, when you see the trap for what it is, you begin to pause. You begin to recognize that raising your voice won't raise your influence. That being louder doesn't make you more right. That being stubborn doesn't make you strong. The strongest people are not the ones who argue best. They're the ones who know when not to argue at all. They see the trap and step around it. They understand that peace is more powerful than pride. And that's the first step to mastering conflict. Not learning how to fight better, but learning how to avoid the fight altogether. There's a moment in every heated conversation where you can feel the direction it's going. The voices rise, the body language tightens, and you know exactly what comes next. Back and forth attacks, both sides digging in deeper, neither side truly listening. But imagine if you had a tool, a phrase so simple yet so powerful that it could stop that momentum instantly. Not after 20 minutes of frustration, not after someone storms out, but right there, in the heat of it, like flipping a switch. That phrase exists and it's only 3 words long. You may be right. Who know, at first glance, those words don't seem earth-shattering. They don't feel like some magical incantation that can calm storms or heal relationships. In fact, they might even sound weak, like you're giving in or backing down. But the truth is the opposite. This phrase is not about surrendering. It's about shifting. It shifts the energy of the conversation. It shifts the posture of your response. And most importantly, it shifts the direction of the argument from destructive to constructive. The brilliance of "you may be right" lies in its balance. It doesn't crown the other person the absolute winner by saying "you are right," But it doesn't dismiss them either. It acknowledges their perspective without invalidating your own. That one small word, may, creates room for dialogue. It says, I see you, I hear you, I respect that your view exists, even if I don't fully agree. And when people feel seen and heard, they lower their defenses. Arguments don't survive in an environment of acknowledgement. Think about the psychology of conflict. People don't argue because they love shouting. They argue because they want to feel understood. They want validation. And the harder they push, the more they're really saying, why aren't you listening to me? That's why when you say, you may be right, it hits differently. You're not fueling the fire with resistance. You're pouring water on it with recognition. The need to keep pushing disappears because their voice has already been acknowledged. Let me give you an example. Picture a husband and wife in the middle of a heated argument about finances. The husband says, "You always spend too much money." Normally, that statement would be met with equal force. "No, I don't. You're the one who wastes money." And suddenly, the original issue is buried under accusations. But if she instead replies, "You may be right. Maybe I haven't been paying close enough attention," the energy changes completely. The fight loses its oxygen. Now, it's not two people battling to prove each other wrong. It's two people stepping into a space where solutions can actually happen. Or think of the workplace. A colleague dismisses your idea in a meeting. That's never going to work. The typical reaction is to push back, to defend your ground, to argue for credibility. But instead, imagine responding with, "You may be right. Let's test it and see." Not only does this stop the argument, it positions you as a collaborator rather than a competitor. You instantly build trust because you've shown humility and open-mindedness without losing your own perspective. The true power of this phrase isn't just in how it calms the other person. It's in how it centers you. By using it, you remind yourself that winning an argument is not the goal. Preserving respect, peace, and clarity is. It takes discipline to respond this way because your ego will scream at you to fight back. But every time you choose to say, "You may be right," you are choosing wisdom over ego, control over chaos, maturity over pride. And that's real strength. Some people might worry that using this phrase makes them look weak, like they're letting the other person walk all over them. But strength is not in how loud you can get, it's in how calm you can remain. Weakness is letting anger dictate your response. Strength is being able to stay steady when everything around you is shouting for escalation. And when people see that in you, when they see that you don't get pulled into unnecessary battles, you actually gain respect, not lose it. It's amazing how much tension 3 little words can dissolve. They're not complicated, they don't require a script, and they don't take hours of training to master. But they do require courage, the courage to choose peace when pride is tempting you to fight. Once you understand the power of this phrase, arguments no longer hold the same control over you. You hold the control. And that's a game changer in every relationship, whether personal or professional. So the next time you feel an argument pulling you in like quicksand, try it. Look the other person in the eye and say calmly, "You may be right." Watch how quickly the storm settles. Watch how different the conversation feels. It may be the simplest phrase you've ever used, but it will also be one of the most powerful tools you'll ever carry with you. Human beings are wired for connection, and at the core of almost every argument lies one simple need, the need to feel heard and respected. That's why this single phrase, "You may be right," works on such a deep psychological level. It goes straight to the heart of what the other person is really after. Because most of the time, when someone is raising their voice or doubling down on their opinion, it isn't about the specific issue. It's about recognition. They want to know that their perspective matters. They want proof that they aren't being dismissed. When you respond with, "You may be right," you're not just throwing words into the air, you're sending a powerful signal. You're saying, "I see you. I acknowledge that what you're saying has value." And that's often all people need. The fascinating thing about human psychology is that the moment someone feels acknowledged, the need to keep fighting evaporates. The defense walls come down. The urgency to convince, to overpower, to argue loses its grip. There's also a reason this phrase doesn't create the same resistance that saying, "You are right," might. If you tell someone, "You are right," you're giving them total victory. That might feel unnatural to you, especially if you don't agree with them. It also can end the conversation abruptly without leaving space for your perspective. But "you may be right" does something subtle. It opens a door. It validates without surrendering. It gives them psychological relief while still keeping room for dialogue. That word "may" is small but mighty. It signals humility, not defeat. It says, "I'm open to your side, even if I haven't completely adopted it." And openness is magnetic. It invites calmer, more thoughtful conversation instead of fueling conflict. Another reason this phrase is so effective is because it interrupts the brain's fight or flight loop. During an argument, both people's brains are operating under stress. Adrenaline rises, heart rate spikes, logical reasoning shuts down, and survival instincts take over. That's why it feels almost impossible to calmly resolve something in the middle of heated words. Your brain isn't wired for problem solving in that state, it's wired for winning or protecting. But when you calmly say, "You may be right," it introduces a disruption. It's unexpected. The other person's brain is anticipating resistance, but instead they get cooperation. That sudden shift helps pull both parties out of fight or flight mode and back into rational thinking. Think of it like hitting a reset button. In the middle of an argument, emotions are like waves crashing against a cliff, relentless and loud. But that simple phrase acts like a dam, slowing the waves, giving space for calm to return. That moment of pause is often all that's needed for reason to step back in. Suddenly, instead of screaming to be heard, both sides can breathe and actually listen. It also works because it gives control back to the other person in a way that feels safe. People often fight harder when they feel powerless, when they sense that their voice doesn't carry weight. "You may be right" restores some of that balance. It hands them a piece of control, not all of it, but enough to make them feel respected. And respect is the currency of healthy communication. Without it, everything breaks down. With it, even the hardest conversations can move forward. Another layer to this is ego. Our egos hate being wrong. They hate losing. That's why arguments spiral out of control. Two egos clashing, both determined not to back down. But this phrase bypasses the ego war. It doesn't attack, it doesn't accuse, it doesn't belittle. Instead, it lowers the temperature by allowing both sides to hold on to dignity. The other person doesn't feel crushed, and you don't feel like you've surrendered. It's a psychological middle ground that keeps both egos intact while still moving toward peace. And let's not overlook what it does for you internally. Saying, "You may be right," is a discipline. It forces you to step back from raw emotion and reframe the situation. It puts you in the driver's seat of your own reaction. You're no longer being yanked around by anger or defensiveness. You're choosing calm intentionally. That sense of control builds confidence. You start realizing that your power doesn't come from arguing better, it comes from mastering your response. And once you experience that shift, you carry it everywhere, with your spouse, your coworkers, your friends, even strangers. So psychologically, this phrase is like a key that unlocks multiple doors at once. It gives the other person validation. It interrupts the stress loop of the brain. It restores respect. It bypasses ego battles, and it grounds you in self-control. No long speech is required. Just 3 small words that pack the weight of an entire strategy for peace. That's why it's not just a phrase, it's a mindset, a tool, a way of living that transforms the way you navigate conflict. It's one thing to understand the theory behind a phrase, and it's another to see it in action. Because in the heat of the moment, theory doesn't always stick. You need something that feels practical, something you can grab hold of right when your emotions are about to take over. That's why I want to walk through some real life situations where this phrase, "You may be right," becomes not just helpful but transformational. Let's start with home. Picture a couple in their kitchen late at night, arguing about household responsibilities. One partner says, "I'm always the one cleaning up after dinner. You never help?" The instinctive reaction is to fire back, "That's not true, I help all the time," which only fuels the frustration. But imagine instead pausing and responding with, "You may be right, maybe I haven't been helping as much as I should." Immediately the atmosphere shifts. Instead of escalating into a battle over who does more or less, it opens the door for a calm conversation about balance and teamwork. That one phrase takes the heat out of the moment and creates space for solutions. Now picture a parent and a teenager. The teenager storms in, saying, "You never understand me." Any parent's natural impulse might be to argue back, "That's not fair. I try to understand you every day." But how much more powerful would it be to take a breath and reply, "You may be right. Maybe I haven't understood everything you're going through." That acknowledgement doesn't mean the parent is admitting failure. It means they're giving the teenager what they crave most, validation. And once the teen feels validated, the tension softens and real communication becomes possible. In the workplace, the opportunities to use this phrase are endless. Imagine you're in a meeting and a colleague shoots down your idea with, "That's never going to work." The common response is defensiveness. Why wouldn't it work? You don't even understand the full plan. But defensiveness only cements division. Now picture saying instead, "You may be right. Maybe there are challenges I haven't thought of." Suddenly, the energy in the room changes. The colleague feels respected, and instead of clashing, you've opened the door to collaboration. Ironically, your willingness to acknowledge them often makes them more willing to acknowledge you. What could have been a power struggle becomes a productive conversation. Even outside of close relationships, this phrase can diffuse tension. Picture driving down the road when another driver cuts you off, and at the next light they start shouting at you, convinced you were in the wrong. Your instinct may be to yell back or prove your innocence, but where does that lead? Nowhere good. Instead, rolling down the window and calmly saying, "You may be right," strips the argument of momentum. The other driver has nowhere to go with their anger because you've given them acknowledgement instead of opposition. And you get to drive away with peace instead of rage. This doesn't just apply in arguments with others, it also works in negotiations. Imagine you're at work asking for a raise, and your boss responds, "I don't think the timing is right." Instead of pushing back aggressively, you might say, "You may be right. Maybe the timing is tough. But here's what I'd like to propose." That phrase diffuses defensiveness, acknowledges reality, and still allows you to present your case. You've shown humility without backing down, and that balance is what often moves people toward agreement. What's powerful about all these scenarios is not that the phrase magically fixes everything. It doesn't make problems disappear. But what it does is shift the posture of the interaction. It lowers the walls, it creates an opening for dialogue, and once the walls come down, solutions that seemed impossible before suddenly become available. We underestimate how much of our energy is wasted on arguments that spiral simply because neither side wants to feel dismissed. By practicing, "You may be right," in everyday life, you're building a habit of disarming tension before it has the chance to grow. The more you use it, the more natural it becomes. At first it might feel awkward, even forced, because it goes against the grain of your pride. But the more you experience the peace it creates, the more you'll find yourself reaching for it instinctively. And here's something even more encouraging. When you use this phrase consistently, people begin to notice. Your spouse notices, your kids notice, your coworkers notice. They start seeing you as the steady one, the calm one, the person who doesn't get pulled into drama. And in a world full of conflict, that quality is magnetic. People trust you more. They respect you more. They're drawn to you, not because you always win arguments, but because you rarely need to. So in real life, whether it's at home, at work, with friends, or with strangers, this phrase is more than just words. It's a tool, a shield, a bridge. It keeps you grounded, it keeps the peace, and it shows others a better way to communicate. And once you experience how quickly it can transform tense situations, you'll wonder how you ever lived without it. In every conflict, there's a split second where you make a choice, whether you realize it or not. That choice is between reacting and responding. On the surface, those two words sound similar, but in practice, they couldn't be further apart. A reaction is fast, emotional, and often regrettable. A response is thoughtful, intentional, and powerful. And the difference between the two can determine whether an argument explodes or dissolves. Reactions are driven by impulse. Someone insults you, and before you even think, you fire back with something sharper. Someone criticizes your work, and instantly you snap into defense mode. It feels automatic because it is. Your body is flooded with adrenaline, your brain perceives a threat, and your ego rushes in to protect you. That's why reactions are so often destructive. They're not guided by wisdom, they're fueled by emotion. They feel good in the moment because you get to unload your frustration or assert your pride, but the aftermath always costs more than the moment gave you. Responses, on the other hand, are deliberate. They take the same situation, the insult, the criticism, the accusation, but instead of letting adrenaline speak for you, you give yourself space to choose your words. A response doesn't come from ego, it comes from clarity. It's calm, measured, and strategic. And the beauty of a response is that it doesn't just protect you in the moment. It also protects the relationship, the respect, and the outcome long after the moment has passed. Here's where the phrase, "You may be right," becomes the perfect example of a response. If someone says, "You never listen," the reaction is to argue back. "That's not true, I always listen." But that only escalates the fight. A response, instead, would be to pause, breathe, and say, "You may be right. Maybe I haven't been listening the way I should." That doesn't mean you're admitting total fault. It means you're choosing peace over pride, and you're controlling the conversation instead of letting the conversation control you. The difference between reacting and responding often comes down to time. A reaction happens instantly. A response happens after a pause. That pause may only be a second or two, but it's powerful. In that pause, you give your brain a chance to catch up to your emotions. You give yourself a chance to remember what actually matters, the relationship, the respect, the bigger picture. That pause is the space where wisdom lives. Think about how many regrets in life are tied to reactions. Words you can't take back, actions you wish you hadn't done, arguments that never needed to happen. Most of those moments didn't come from carefully considered responses. They came from raw reactions. On the flip side, think about the times you chose to respond calmly, even when you were provoked. Chances are those are moments you look back on with pride because you didn't lose yourself in the storm. You stayed steady. The world is full of people who react. It's easy. Anyone can raise their voice when they're angry. Anyone can snap back when they feel disrespected. But it takes strength to respond. It takes discipline to hold your tongue, to breathe through the frustration, to choose words that de-escalate instead of inflame. That's real power. Power isn't being the loudest in the room. It's being the one who doesn't need to be loud at all. And here's the paradox: the more you respond instead of react, the more influence you gain. People begin to see you as steady, reliable, and wise. They trust your voice because they know it won't be driven by anger or pride. That's why leaders in any context, whether at home, at work, or in society, are defined by their ability to respond. Followers react, leaders respond. One of the best ways to practice this is to use that phrase as a trigger. The next time you feel yourself boiling up in an argument, instead of letting your reaction spill out, catch yourself, pause, and say, "You may be right." That phrase buys you time. It gives you breathing room. It cools down the heat enough for you to shift from reaction to response. And once you build that muscle, once you learn to pause before speaking, you'll notice how differently people engage with you. Arguments that used to last hours will dissolve in minutes. Conversations that used to spiral will stay calm. At the end of the day, life gives you countless opportunities to react. But every reaction is really a test, an invitation to rise higher and choose a response instead. And the more you respond, the more peace you create, the more respect you earn, and the more control you have over your own emotions. That's the difference. One keeps you stuck in cycles of conflict, the other sets you free. And freedom is always found in the response, never in the reaction. When you start using a phrase like, "You may be right," it's not just about ending one argument in the moment. It's about setting a new tone for your life. The impact goes far beyond that single conversation. Think of it like dropping a pebble into a pond. The pebble is small, but the ripples move outward, touching everything around it. Mastering this one simple skill doesn't just change how you handle conflict, it changes how people experience you, how they trust you, and ultimately, how you experience yourself. The first ripple is peace. Imagine what it feels like to walk away from disagreements without the usual knots in your stomach, without replaying the conversation over and over in your head, without carrying bitterness for hours or days. That's what happens when you practice this consistently. Arguments no longer drain you, because they never get the chance to grow. You begin to live with a lighter heart. Your home feels calmer. Your work environment feels safer. And your relationships, instead of being battlefields, become places of connection. Peace isn't something you hope for anymore. It becomes something you create. The next ripple is respect. People start noticing how you handle yourself. They see that you don't take the bait, that you don't get pulled into unnecessary drama, that you don't fight for the sake of pride. And in a world where conflict seems to dominate, that calmness stands out. Your spouse begins to admire the way you keep perspective. Your kids begin to see you as steady instead of reactive. Your coworkers begin to trust that when things get tense, you're the one who won't make it worse. Respect is rarely demanded, it's earned. And the fastest way to earn it is to show self-control in situations where others lose theirs. The ripple spreads even further into influence. When people respect you, they also begin to listen to you differently. Your words carry more weight, not because you speak louder, but because you speak wiser. They know you won't waste words on arguments or ego battles. And that gives you a kind of quiet authority. You become the person in the room who can shift the energy with a few calm sentences. You become the one people seek out for advice because they know your perspective won't be clouded by anger or defensiveness. That's the kind of influence that builds leaders. Another ripple is growth. Every time you choose, "You may be right," over shouting, you're not just ending an argument, you're training yourself. You're strengthening the muscle of patience, humility, and wisdom. And the more you practice, the stronger you get. It's like lifting weights at the gym. At first it feels awkward, maybe even uncomfortable. But over time, what once felt heavy becomes second nature. You realize you don't have to prove yourself in every situation. You realize your worth isn't tied to winning arguments. And that inner growth transforms you far beyond conflict. It spills into your confidence, your decision-making, and your sense of self. Then there's the ripple of legacy. Think about the people watching you. Your children, your younger siblings, your team at work. They're learning from you even when you don't realize it. When they see you handle conflict with grace instead of aggression, they learn that it's possible. They learn that the calmness is strength, that humility is power. And those lessons don't stop with them. They carry it into their own relationships, their own families, their own workplaces. Your choice to end arguments differently can shape not just your life, but theirs too. That's how a simple phrase becomes a generational shift. Finally, the ripple circles back to you in the form of freedom. Because when you no longer feel trapped in the cycle of arguments, you experience a kind of liberation. You're free from the need to prove yourself every time. You're free from the emotional hangovers of fights that went too far. You're free to walk into tough conversations with confidence instead of dread. And freedom is priceless. It gives you space to focus on what really matters, building deeper relationships, pursuing your goals, enjoying your life without constant conflict pulling you down. The truth is, most people spend years, even decades, caught in the trap of arguments because they never learn another way. But when you master this skill, when you learn to consistently use, you may be right, as a tool of peace, you set yourself apart. You become the calm in the storm. You become the voice of reason in the chaos. And that ripple effect will carry through every area of your life. It's not about 3 words, it's about the kind of person those 3 words help you become. At the end of the day, arguments don't make us stronger, they make us smaller. They shrink our patience, they shrink our perspective, and they shrink the respect between us and the people we care about. But one small shift, just 3 words, can change all of that. You may be right. It's not about giving up, it's about stepping up. It's not about weakness, it's about wisdom. When you use this phrase, you choose peace over pride, clarity over chaos, connection over conflict. You stop pouring fuel on the fire, and you start showing people a better way forward. And the more you practice it, the more it ripples into every part of your life, your family, your friendships, your work, even the way you see yourself. So the next time you feel an argument pulling you in, remember this: your power is not in having the last word. Your power is in ending the fight before it even begins. That's not weakness, that's real strength. Because anyone can argue, but only the strong can choose peace.